They thought they were playing chess with a pawn. That was their first mistake. They mistook your silence for simplicity, your patience for predictability. They believed they were moving in shadows, crafting elegant little traps behind your back, convinced you were stumbling through life blindfolded. But while they focused on your surface, you were busy mastering the unseen board beneath them. They called your restraint weakness, not knowing you were memorizing every angle, every bluff, every premature smirk they wore. And when you finally moved, you didn't raise your voice. You just closed the game with such finality that even the so-called masters looked up in disbelief. They weren't prepared for a checkmate like that. One that didn't just win, but rewrote the rules entirely. This was never about a game. This was about control. The psychological kind. The type that doesn't shout but whispers in proximity. They wanted to control the narrative, the tempo, the perception. They wanted to make you small in places you once gave them power. They studied your empathy, charted your patterns, twisted your trust into leverage. But you saw through it. You didn't flinch when the board tilted. You took notes. And in that silence, you evolved. Your mind sharpened. Your boundaries crystallized. You started watching the moves behind the moves. You saw how they sacrificed respect for short-term gain. You saw how they traded honesty for status. And while they danced for attention, you built the finale. When it came, it wasn't loud. It wasn't cruel. It was final. You made one move, subtle, irreversible, and the board froze. The masters didn't applaud. They left. Because nothing is more unnerving than someone you underestimated suddenly becoming the mirror that shows you your mediocrity. You didn't just outplay them. You revealed how shallow their game was. They played for claps, for eyes, for control. You played for truth, and truth has a gravity of its own. Now they walk with hesitation. Their strategies have turned brittle. Their performances echo in empty halls. And all of it, their exit, their confusion, their silence, is just another piece in the checkmate they didn't see coming. It wasn't about beating them. It was about elevating beyond the board they used to trap people on. You realized something they couldn't tie. The only winning move in some games is to rise above the need to keep playing. You stopped playing to be seen. You started moving as someone who already knows. That's what broke them. You stopped announcing your evolution and let it speak through your absence. You let them believe you were still one move away from collapse, until you delivered a conclusion so clean, so complete, it didn't need closure. Just silence, just presence, just the echo of their own limits whispering, "You're outmatched." People like them rely on reaction, on chaos, on needing you to fight back so they can justify their own twisted version of events. But you refused to dance in that dysfunction. You smiled. You walked away. You let their assumptions rot in peace. And when the consequences arrived, no one could pin it on you, because you weren't fighting. You were executing. Every boundary, every recalibration, every new standard you implemented wasn't an attack. It was a move, a final one. The kind that doesn't just protect your peace, but ends cycles. And when you ended theirs, they felt it, not as betrayal, but as exposure. Psychologically, it takes mastery to hold your fire until the moment they think they've won. You didn't interrupt them. You let them believe the mask they were wearing was enough. You let them laugh, lie, maneuver. You watched how they twisted empathy into opportunity. And then you stopped showing up, not just physically, but energetically. Your withdrawal wasn't a retreat. It was a verdict. They didn't lose you. They used up their access. And by the time they realized the rules had changed, the board was already yours. The only thing left for them to do was resign. The masters quit not because they lacked skill, but because they lacked vision. They couldn't see you coming. They couldn't imagine you operating on a level where emotional intelligence, spiritual discipline, and psychological foresight collide into an unstoppable force. You didn't just play the game better. You played deeper. Your checkmate wasn't about destruction. It was about demonstrating the power of stillness, of restraint, of long-range thinking. You taught them what real dominance looks like, not in control over others, but in absolute control of yourself. You don't crumble anymore. You choose when to appear. You don't fight for space. You become the space. The aftermath is poetic. They ask each other where it went wrong. They retrace their steps. They poke at memories and reconstruct stories in hopes of softening the truth. But no amount of nostalgia or self-justification can undo what you've become. Because now, every new connection you make holds the weight of that checkmate. People feel it when they speak to you. They feel the structure, the clarity, the untouchable calm. They sense that you've played with devils and walked away unburned. You don't announce wisdom. You radiate it, and those who recognize it either rise to meet it or leave the room entirely. You didn't need an audience. You didn't need revenge. You needed elevation. And you achieved it not through noise, but through unapologetic precision. They thought the end would be a war. They never considered it would be a coronation. Your crown wasn't handed to you. It was earned through wounds, through discipline, through psychological rebirth. Now you don't just enter rooms, you tilt them. You don't just win conversations, you redirect narratives. And the people who once viewed you as manageable now whisper about the transformation they couldn't predict. They didn't hate you because you harmed them. You never laid a trap. You never raised your voice. You didn't need to. All you had to do was be different. And that was enough. Because you weren't vibrating on the frequency they understood. You didn't gossip to bond. You didn't lower your standards to make them feel comfortable. You didn't shrink to fit in their pocket-sized expectations. You walked into rooms like you belonged there, and that alone fractured their illusion. Toxic people don't respond to kindness the way you expect. It doesn't soften them. It stings. It reminds them of everything they've buried. So when you chose grace over chaos, boundaries over performance, solitude over forced acceptance, they called you arrogant. But they weren't reacting to your attitude. They were reacting to your alignment. You didn't speak their language anymore. You were no longer programmable. That's what they couldn't handle. When you were still caught in the maze of people pleasing, you were easy to mold. You bent, you adjusted, you absorbed everyone's discomfort just to keep the peace. But once you found your signal, once you started living from the inside out instead of the outside in, you became dangerous to the structure they relied on. You started telling the truth, even when it wasn't digestible. You started saying no without guilt. You didn't just draw lines, you enforced them. And every time you did, they felt a piece of their power slip. You weren't attacking them. You were simply unbothered. And to toxic people, that's war. You healed, quietly, radically, with discipline they never imagined you had. And while you were evolving, they were rehearsing the same tactics. Same drama, same bait. But you stopped biting. You stopped attending every emotional fire they lit. You stopped picking up calls that always led to chaos. You stopped explaining decisions made from self-respect. And suddenly, they couldn't access you. Not because you blocked them, but because they no longer existed on your wavelength. You went up, they stayed down. And when you meet someone on a lower frequency with calm, instead of conflict, they don't get curious. They get offended. Because your peace doesn't validate their pain, your clarity exposes their confusion. They started calling you distant, cold, too intense, too self-focused. Not because you were any of those things, but because you refused to play the old game. Toxic people crave familiarity. They feed on roles, patterns, dysfunctions that repeat like reruns. But you went off script. You became unpredictable. And unpredictability terrifies people who survive by scripting outcomes. You were supposed to react. You were supposed to beg. You were supposed to apologize for shining too bright. Instead, you just kept glowing, kept learning, kept sharpening. You didn't say a word, but your energy said everything. And that silence, it screamed, "I'm not for sale anymore." You made them uncomfortable without lifting a finger, because your presence wasn't soft anymore. It was sovereign. Your smile wasn't a request. It was a revelation. You'd learned how to sit with yourself long enough that validation became irrelevant. You stopped performing, and that made the actors uneasy. You stopped accommodating, and the manipulators lost their footing. You didn't accuse, you didn't attack, you just elevated. And that elevation echoed. Every time they entered a room and saw you unbothered, they heard the sound of their control crumbling. That's the secret they don't teach you. Growth is loud to those who benefit from your stagnation. They started to sabotage not because you were wrong, but because you were winning without them. And toxic people view your independence as betrayal. They don't want you broken. They want you almost fixed. Just enough to keep coming back. Just enough to keep asking them for advice they never take themselves. But you changed the channel. And they kept screaming at the static. They kept trying to reconnect, using the same old lies, unaware that you'd built a firewall from self-awareness. And now, every attempt to manipulate bounces off your peace like water off polished armor. You didn't become evil. You became unavailable to evil. And they mistook your distance for ego. But ego is loud. Ego demands to be seen. You didn't need to be seen. You needed to see clearly. And once you saw who they were when they thought you needed them, the game was over. You no longer ignored the comments laced with jealousy. You no longer excused the backhanded praise. You connected the dots and chose to walk. Not because you hated them, but because you loved yourself more. And that shift, that deep, quiet, internal shift, it did more damage than any argument ever could. You became the mirror they avoided. And every time they heard your name, they felt a flicker of shame. Not because you harmed them, but because they know they would have destroyed you if you hadn't evolved. That's what eats them alive. That they underestimated your mind. That they miscalculated your soul. And now, while they're still narrating chapters you've outgrown, you're writing new volumes. Ones with healthier characters, clearer plots, and no space for side roles who drain the storyline. They want to be part of your arc again. But you've turned your life into sacred ground, and access is earned now. You've become a frequency, a calibration. You're not louder, you're deeper. You don't attract chaos, you repel it. Your presence filters the room before you say a word, and they feel it. That vibration they can't name. That subtle throb in the atmosphere that says, this one sees too clearly to be played. You weren't built to soothe dysfunction anymore. You were built to transcend it, and toxic people hate that. Not because you left, but because they can still feel you, rising, evolving, becoming untouchable, without needing to be cruel to do it. The frequency you're on now doesn't tolerate chaos disguised as closeness. It doesn't flatter dysfunction. It doesn't entertain emotional theatrics as a means of connection. You no longer confuse longevity with loyalty. You've realized that some people were simply there because you hadn't yet raised your standard of vibration. But now that you have, their energy doesn't just feel incompatible. It feels offensive. Your nervous system rejects what your heart used to excuse. Your spirit, once so eager to see the best in others, now demands evidence. Now you sit in silence and watch, not out of bitterness, but from a clarity that only survival can forge. That's the cost of true elevation, losing the crowd that once fed off your confusion, and you pay it gladly. Their energy recoils at yours because it no longer feeds them. You stopped serving guilt meals. You stopped apologizing for your shine. You stopped picking up emotional slack just to keep the illusion of closeness alive. Now your presence feels like judgment, even when you're quiet. Not because you condemn, but because you reflect. And toxic people can't stand reflection unless it flatters them.